Hello there, welcome to the Saroy channel, wherever you are in the world, and so much love to each and every one of you. How are you doing? I do hope you're doing great. I'm doing fabulous, thank you very much. And we're now on part 4 of our story tonight, which is incredibly exciting. So let's get started, shall we? Ned's account. Everything about me is predictable. I'm boringly set in my ways. But that's the way I am, and I make no apologies for it. I eat the same routine food day after day, order the same food from the menu, and I love the same woman I loved when I first laid eyes on her for the very first time, at 14 years old. In my eyes, Alice was the most beautiful woman I had ever beheld. She had such a cute, endearing way about her when she talked and laughed, and I was completely smitten. I knew she was the one for me. I was not remotely interested in anybody else. It was her sister Ina, who was a year younger than Alice, who was always trying to sabotage our relationship for some reason. Ina would deliberately wear seductive, tight-fitting clothing that made her look vulgar and cheap. She did not have Alice's class or style. I always think that if a woman lets it all hang out rather inappropriately, then she's desperate for attention, due to issues of low self-esteem. As why would she be seeking to be the centre of attention otherwise? Ina was exactly like that. She brazenly told me I'd be so much happier with her than with her sister. She would tell me that Alice was so dreadfully boring, and that she would be the one to show me a much better time than her sister ever could. On several occasions Ina would try to seduce me unabashedly, tearing her clothes off in front of me when her sister was not around, and telling me coquettishly, in a flirtatious manner, that she knew I wanted her. Nothing could be further from the truth. I mean, what kind of a sister does that to her own sibling? It disgusted and revolted me that she would dare betray her sister's trust like this. I suspected she was insanely jealous of Alice, and this was some kind of sibling competitiveness, of wanting something that her sister had that she didn't. I would tell her, "I'm sorry. I'm not interested in you, Ina. Now please put your clothes back on before you embarrass yourself. I won't tell Alice about this blunder of yours." And I did not. I knew Alice would be utterly mortified if she knew her sister was just throwing herself at me indiscriminately, with no shame whatsoever. Ina was furious that I was not interested in her, as she seemed to think that all men would buckle at the very sight of a naked woman, as if we were pathetically weak and had no sense of self-control whatsoever. In the end, I was certain Ina had got the message, and finally she stopped pulling some of those warped kind of stunts on me. I hoped and suspected that she'd finally grown up. I mean, we were in our 40s, for goodness sake, no longer teenagers with wild, raging hormones flying all over the place. But I conveniently forgot about the saying that hell hath no fury, like a woman scorned. I failed to appreciate that just because I had rejected Ina's wanton advances, it didn't mean that she'd stopped wanting me. Indeed, perhaps my abject dismissal of her had made her desire for me unquenchable. One evening when my wife was out of town, doing a presentation for work, I received an anonymous text from an unknown caller, telling me my wife Alice was cheating on me. I don't know why I was so quick to believe it, but I guess I thought no one could be this cruel and unkind as to send me a random text like this, just to rattle my cage and to upset me. So it must be true, even though it was profoundly out of character for Alice to behave like this. I guess I was terribly naive. The message said, "I'm looking out for you, Ned. I think you should know your wife is having an affair behind your back. I've seen her arm in arm with her fancy man at the business conference. You're a good man, Ned. You deserve to know the truth about what your wife is really like." So there I was at the diner in town, plying myself with an excess of alcohol, and allowing my inhibitions to fold away like a beach umbrella. I had privately confided in Mr. Cowslipper, who owns the Pig and Grill, about my sorry plight. He told me not to believe a random text that someone had sent my cell phone, especially if it was anonymous, as if they had anything to say, they should own it. Alice loves the bones of you, Ned, he told me. I'm quite sure she's not cheating on you. Frankly, she's not the type. And I personally don't think drowning your sorrows with alcohol is doing you any favours, Ned. Why don't you ask Alice yourself when she gets home from her business conference what is going on? I'm frightened to ask her, I told Mr. Cowslipper, because if Alice is cheating on me, then our relationship is over for good, and I can't imagine my life without her. Maybe if I turn a blind eye to it, it'll go away. Oh, don't be like that, Ned, said Mr. Cowslipper. You need to find out what's going on with your wife. Otherwise it'll drive you insane. Take it from me. I'm not a big drinker, but that night I drank far too much. I felt desperately sorry for myself. The alcohol anaesthetized the pain and drowned my sorrows to an extent. My head was whirling, my eyes began seeing stars, and I was awkwardly staggering around the place as if I'd lost my balance. Mr. Cowslipper said he was happy to give me a lift home, because I couldn't drive in my current physical state. But I decided I could walk home. I didn't live too far away from the diner, and me and Alice would occasionally walk to the diner on a warm summer's evening to enjoy the physical exercise. The trouble is, walking home sober is very different to walking home 2 sheets to the wind, when it's practically impossible to walk in a straight line. I figured it would be no big deal to walk home alone. I decided to take a significant shortcut through the woods, which would cut my journey home by half. In the cold light of day, I'd never have made such a foolish choice. But when you're drunk, a lot of things seem like a good idea at the time, as rational common sense and sound reasoning elude you. I do recall putting one foot in front of another and walking down the trail through the trees, and then I pretty much remember nothing else, as everything becomes foggy and vague. I do recall waking up to find something appeared to be carrying me on their oversized back, and they walked with an incredibly smooth gait. I looked down to see that I had been thrown over this hairy back. I could feel the rise and fall of this thing's breathing. The journey was smooth, but it was so ethereal, so dreamlike. I thought it had to be a dream. And it was such a pleasant experience. It was the kind of dream from which you did not want to awaken, for I felt swaddled in a protective-like cocoon, like a babe in its mother's arms. The next thing I know is I'm being lowered onto the chair on our wraparound porch. I opened my eyes and observed this huge Bigfoot staring down at me, asking me if I'm going to be all right. She looked concerned about my welfare and my well-being. It was impossible to be afraid of her, even though she was the most intimidating creature I have ever beheld. The Bigfoot was female. I didn't observe her breasts or anything to establish this fact, but I knew instinctively she was female. She had that matriarchal energy about her that was tangible. I was astounded, realizing I must have passed out in the woods from my drunken intoxication, and this female Bigfoot had brought me safely back home, when she could so easily have just abandoned me in the woods. How did she even know where I lived? I might have been drunk, but I was sobering up a little, and knew what I was seeing. At a guess, she was about 9 foot tall, possibly 700 to 800 pounds, and covered in long flowing dark hair with auburn highlights. She smelt woody like the grove, and when she carried me on her Herculean-sized back, I recall thinking how peculiarly strange it was that I could smell in this dream of mine. The thing I was most staggered about was how human-looking her face was, and her spirited treacle-coloured eyes were benevolently kind. It was as if she heard my very thoughts, for she answered me in my head, in some kind of telepathic exchange. She never spoke to me verbally. "Of course I know where you live. I've seen you around these parts often enough, even though you've likely never observed me before. But I know things, lots of things, and I knew you were not going to make it home in your sorry state. You were tripping over everything in the grove, stumbling into all kinds of things. It wasn't safe. Your energy was ambiguously foggy, very disorientated and vague. So I brought you back to safety. You should never walk in the woods like that in such an intoxicated state. There's a family of mountain lions who would have easily jumped you. The female is always looking out for an easy meal." "Are you for real?" I asked her in my head. "Or is this an absurd dream of mine?" "Of course I'm real. But you might think I was a dream in the morning." "How will I know that you're not a dream?" I asked her gingerly. She considered my thoughts for a moment. "I like people to think I'm not real. But I'll tell you what I'll do for you. I'll leave a footprint outside the porch on a muddy patch as a signature to validate your experience with me. Your kind love to fuss over our big footprints that we leave behind and ruminate whether my people exist or not. We enjoy teasing you in this regard. But if you find a footprint belonging to one of my people, it's not a random chance event. We left it there on purpose for you to find." After she said that, she glided away. I woke up the following morning, feeling befuddled and convoluted. I was lying on one of the sun lounges on our wraparound porch, with no memory or recollection of my drunken journey, from how I managed to get from the bar at the diner through the woods to the wraparound porch of our property. I remember vividly recalling a dream, and I told myself that that was some weird dream because it was so lucidly vivid. But why would I dream of a Bigfoot of all things? I'd never even believed the cryptic creature was real. But it was definitely an explicit dream, I told myself. And then I recalled the part when I'd asked the female Bigfoot how I would know that this was not a dream. And she told me she'd leave a large footprint on a muddy patch on the outside of the wraparound porch. And sure enough, there it was, larger than life, a massive footprint that left me in no doubt that my dream had been real. Moments later, my wife arrives at the house, mortified to see that I hadn't made it into the house last night, after my fortuitous visit to the diner, as the front door still remained locked. "I can't believe you, Ned. I go off for a business conference and return to find you in such a sorry, discombobulated state. I got a call from Mr. Cowslipper, would you believe? He told me he was very concerned about you. You were as drunk as a skunk last night, I believe. He said you were making quite the spectacle of yourself, telling everybody you were grievously disappointed in me because I'd let you down bitterly, because I had been going around with some other man. Mr. Cowslipper tried to get you to eat a burger to mop up some of the alcohol that you'd ingested, but you insisted on parking yourself at the bar like an empty car engine, hankering for plenty of gas. He assumed someone had given you a lift home from the diner, as your truck appears to be still parked outside the diner in the parking bay. Mr. Cowslipper told me that you got a text from someone informing you that I was having an affair. Who would send you a text like that, Ned? They're sick in the head. But I'm disappointed in you, Ned. I'm your wife, for goodness sake. Why would you have such a low opinion of me? I would never cheat on you, Ned. Never. I love you, for God's sake. Whatever would make you think I would do such a calculated thing? Because you're too good for me, Alice. I don't deserve you. I wouldn't blame you if you did cheat on me. I'm not exactly the most exciting, inspiring man on this planet. I'm very set in my ways. Some people might call me boring and unadventurous. I'm very regimental in what I do. My wife ran a hand through my hair and said, "What am I going to do with you, Ned? You're a silly old fool. When am I going to get it into your thick skull that you're the very best thing that has happened to me, and that I'm a lucky woman to have you? And I'm sorry, but I'm not going anywhere. You're stuck with me for the rest of your life, Ned Cunningham, whether you like it or not, I'm afraid. Yes, I agree with you. You're not the most adventurous man I've ever met. You're rigidly set in your ways, and very traditional in all that you do.
But I like you the way you are, Ned Cunningham. It's part of your charm and your allure, and I wouldn't change you for the world." I was to find out later that Ina, my wife's jealous sister, was the one that had sent me the text. Why had I not guessed it was her? Of course, I confronted her about it, telling her I'd traced the call, which wasn't true, and she admitted it to me. "Why would you send such a cruel text to me?" I asked her. Ina was completely candid with me, and unabashedly said, "Because I want you to leave your wife Alice. You chose the wrong sister, Ned. I've always loved you, Ned. Can you not see that, or are you completely blind and dumb? My sister could never love you like I do. You should leave her, Ned. We'd be so good together, the two of us. Admit it. It would really work with us both." "You're talking nonsense, Ina," I retorted. "I love Alice, and I've never particularly liked you terribly much. I've only put up with you because you're family. But the wicked stunt you pulled on me was not kind. I like Alice because she doesn't pretend to be something she's not. She's confident in her own skin, loyal. You could do with learning some lessons from her example." Ina made a face. "Wake up, Ned. You believed Alice was cheating on you, so it shows you don't trust her. And in my book, that speaks volumes." "That's where you're wrong, Ina. It's not that I don't trust my wife Alice. I just can't believe how lucky I am, and that a woman like her would be so committed to me. I feel so privileged that she's interested in me and not anybody else." "You see, you're as blind as a bat, Ned Cunningham. Have you looked in the mirror lately and seen how handsome you are? You're the one that's far too good for her, not the other way round." "We'll say no more about this," I said gingerly. "I don't want my wife to know what a vindictive, spiteful sister she has. You need to stop playing your silly little games. Get over it, Ina. I'll never be interested in you. I love my wife with all my heart. Get it, woman? Grow up, will you? And stop playing these kiddie games. They're juvenile." "What on earth is wrong with you, Ned?" she said obsequiously. "Can't you see I love you?" "I'm not interested in you, Ina. Get over it, will you?" It was clear that Ina was jealous of what me and my wife Alice had together, and wanted to destroy our relationship. She really was poisonous. Needless to say, when I told Mr. Cowslip about the Bigfoot that had carried me through the woods in my inebriated state and placed me on the sun lounger, he said to me, "I'd love to believe your story, Ned. I really would. But you were drunk that night. You could have been dreaming about the Bigfoot, hallucinating. I don't mean to be unkind, but your body isn't used to ingesting so much alcohol, so you could have dreamed it all up." I knew, of course, that he had a point. I went home to take a photograph of the big footprint on the side of the porch that could only have been made by Bigfoot, that I had observed so carefully in my sobriety, to prove to Mr. Cowslipper that this was no dream. But it had been cunningly wiped away, so I knew no one would ever believe my story. I believed the female Bigfoot removed her own footprint, so I'd not show it to anybody else. I asked myself, of course, many times if I imagined it all, in a drunken stupor. I know I did not, and besides I don't have much of an imagination, and I never remember my dreams. "So Ned told you the story?" asked Lucinda, looking from Gina to Maggie aghast. "Well, my father told us the story," said Gina. "But after your account with 2 female Bigfoots watching over you behind the motel, I'm inclined to believe that Ned's story is not fictitious, but is true. I just thought, like my father, that in his drunken state he had to have imagined it all. But now I'm not so sure." "Of course Ned did not make this up. There's no way this is spurious. It must have really happened," said Lucinda insistently. "Well, now you put it like that, I guess you're right," said Maggie reflectively. By God, Ned's story must also be true. That female Bigfoot carried him back home to safety. Isn't that incredible?
Mrs. Petticock's account, 1 year later. People around these parts think I'm a snoop, and maybe I am, but I like to know what's going on in our small town. And what's wrong with that, I ask you? I believe it's good to be vigilant and to have your wits about you at all times. So I've always had the eyes of a voucher. Nothing ever gets past me. When Mr. Cowslipper hired that young lady Lucinda to work at the Pig and Grill diner, I thought he'd lost leave of his senses. I mean, he knew nothing about her at all. I knew at once she had something to hide. What was a 25-year-old girl like her doing in our rural Montana town, when she'd clearly come from a big city? I had a sense it was either Chicago or New York, but I could not be entirely sure. She was like a fish out of water here, and I knew she didn't belong. Everybody began speculating about her, as you do, wondering why she'd moved into a remote place like our town. Youngsters usually can't wait to leave our town, chase after their big dreams in a large city like Boston, Chicago, San Francisco, Atlanta or New York. So why come here to our small town? Something was clearly amiss. I could smell that from a mile off. But Mr. Cowslipper, bless his cotton socks, would give house room to a shark if given the chance, because that's exactly what he's like. I wondered if Lucinda was wanted by the police, or was running away from an abusive husband or boyfriend. But I knew she was running away from something, and I needed to find out why she was on the run, and who she was. Unfortunately, I was making absolutely no progress in my inquiries, as Lucinda was not terribly forthcoming about anything concerning herself, and Mr. Cowslipper did an excellent job in telling us all to mind our own business and stop pestering Lucinda by asking her awkward questions. I think she'd say something like, "I'd rather not talk about my past if you don't mind." Mr. Cowslipper was a glutton for punishment. Always got a soft spot for anyone who's had a hard life, it would seem. He wanted to help Lucinda. Not only did he give her a job, but in no time at all he'd promoted her to manager. I mean, who does that? All right, I will admit she was a great manager. I'll give her that. Efficient and hard-working. That girl did not know the meaning of the word lazy. She was a positive role model for Gina Cowslipper, who does tend to enjoy being a little lackadaisical, if the truth be told. I think people from large cities tend to know how to work hard, and Lucinda was no exception to that golden rule. If that wasn't bad enough, Mr. Cowslipper invited Lucinda to live in his own family home. I mean, who in their right mind does that? Asks a perfect stranger just to move in with them. He knew nothing about Lucinda. He was so protective towards her, treating her like a daughter. In no time at all, everybody liked Lucinda very much, and she quickly settled down in our small town like a duck to water, and all questions completely stopped. It was almost as if she had always lived here. People quickly forgot she was an outsider. But not me. Never me. I was watching her like a hawk all the time. I knew sooner or later I'd learn a lot more about our Lucinda. If I know anything about secrets from past learned experience, they have a nasty habit of seeping out like the honey in a comb. It would seem I was the only salient person actually asking questions long after all the speculation about Lucinda had died down. I had in mind to keep a beady eye on Lucinda, and that's exactly what I did. One day a couple arrived in our small town to perform in an eating contest at the Pig and Grill. They were offering anyone eager to take on the all-you-can-eat challenge that had recently been advertised, a prize, a T-shirt, and, of course, a place on their wall of fame. Mr. Cowslipper believed a competitive eating challenge like this, with a time limit of 45 minutes, would be a good way to promote the diner, encouraging outsiders to pay our unassuming Montana town a visit.
I do remember a petite woman arrived in our town and completely amazed all the locals when in 40 minutes she'd gobbled up a huge mound of food, large enough to feed a family of 6, in that small window of time, which included ribs, steaks, burgers, chips, coleslaw, and macaroni cheese. It was 11 pounds of food, and no one to date had defeated that monumental challenge. Everyone was clapping and cheering as the young woman managed to get down all the food, which she washed down with a strawberry milkshake to help reduce the flavour fatigue. She was the first woman to succeed in the challenge, so she was subsequently put on the Wall of Fame at the Pig and Grill Diner. At one point in the eating challenge, Mr. Cowslipper asked Lucinda to get some tomato ketchup for the young contestant. As in between burps, which was causing everyone to laugh hysterically, she was struggling to eat her fries, smothering them with Heinz tomato ketchup to help get them down, as they had become unpalatable, as they were now stone cold. So I think the girl regretted not tackling the fries first in her challenge. I could see that Lucinda's image had been caught on the footage when she handed the young lady the tomato ketchup, with a warm, congenial smile on her face, saying, "You can do it! I know you can!" I remember thinking to myself privately that Lucinda had been caught on camera, so she'd be seen on YouTube all over the country, and it just takes one person to notice her image. If Lucinda is wanted by anyone, they would see her in this video clip and soon catch up with her in our small town. Even Lucinda appeared blindly oblivious to what she had done to blow her cover. I am surprised she was not more vigilant. Perhaps she thought she was on camera for a fleeting second and that no one would recognize her. I knew she obviously dyed her brown hair blonde, as her brown roots were beginning to show. I wondered if her blonde hair was a disguise. I suspected it probably was, and not a good one at that. I hoped for her sake she wasn't wanted by an abusive husband, which I suspected might indeed be the case, which could potentially mean that Lucinda was in danger, and my concern for her grew exponentially. I decided I needed to keep a keen watch out for the woman. Everyone in town appeared to be desperately fast asleep, but I was wide awake, so nothing would get past me. It would seem my hunch soon paid off, as a week later to the day, I spotted a mysterious man wearing a hoodie, furtively following Lucinda around town. Regretfully, it was late autumn, so the days were getting colder. No one paid much attention to the young man in the hoodie. Ostensibly in summer, someone going around in a hoodie would draw people's attention to them, as no one hides their faces in hot weather, do they? Let's just say with the grim spell of cold weather we'd been having, it was perfectly normal to swaddle your head in a warm fleece, without anybody suspecting a thing. Some might have thought this young man was one of the locals, and given him no further thought, but I knew differently. I regret to say that Lucinda did not appear to notice that she was being clandestinely followed around, but I most certainly did. For someone who is hiding out in a small town, trying to make herself inconspicuous, she certainly wasn't very perceptive or sharp. I sensed at once that this man, whoever he was up to no good, for that was clear to see. So I surreptitiously began following him around everywhere he went. I learnt he'd booked into Roach's seedy motel of all places, and was staying in room number 142. Someone died in one of the motel rooms a while back, a year ago I believe it was, and Roach was getting no end of complaints about that particular room, that people complained was haunted. But Roach enjoyed placing people in that room. So fortunately for this man, he wasn't staying in the haunted room, which was a bit of a pity, because we might have got him out of town sooner. Even a team of paranormal investigators stayed in that room, I believe, and didn't even last the night, as something freaked them the hell out. But whatever it was, I was never privy to find out. I hasten to say, Roach has got absolutely no scruples. I've known that man for many years, and although he's completely harmless, he's a little on the creepy side, and has a slightly offensive sense of humour that tends to rub some people up the wrong way.
Many people who've stayed at the motel describe it as a Norman Bates-like experience, and they would not be wrong about that. Roach and his brother both embody the word creepy to perfection. I knew Roach could easily be blackmailed. He didn't have much in the way of moral ethics on his side. So I knew that if I paid him generously enough to do some snooping on my behalf, he wouldn't bat an eyelid. Roach used the spare key he had for room 142, where the man in the hoodie was invariably staying. He was out there in the parking bay, enjoying a cigarette, talking on his cell phone intensely to someone, and was conveniently distracted, while Roach surreptitiously crept into his room to do some investigation. He discovered the man's ID in his wallet, which appeared to be on the bedstand. It would seem his name was Warren Wheeler, known to his friends as Wasp. He was from Chicago. I had a name to go on, so I now knew who I was following around. Every Tuesday and Thursday afternoon, Gina and Lucinda, who had become like tight sisters, would take the family large black poodle Gunner on one of the well-known walking trails outside town for a walk. I knew they were going there later on in the afternoon, and I had my suspicions that the man in the hoodie would be hot on their trail. Many people walked their dogs on this particular trail, and usually there were a collection of cars in the bay. But on this occasion it was just Gina's car. Mr. Wheeler's car was soon parked right next to hers, so I knew he'd followed both the girls on this walking trail, and that got my immediate attention. I hasten to say there were no other dog walkers around, which was an awful pity, as there was a local football game being played in town that everybody appeared to be watching. But Gina hated football, as did Lucinda, so they had absolutely no interest in watching the game. Mr. Cowslipper had begged them to come along, saying it was part of the community spirit to be involved in local sports games. It was important to support their hometown team, but those two girls had absolutely no interest in doing that. "Dad," Gina had said, "Lucinda and I have been working hard at the diner all morning. We're tired. We don't want to watch a boring game of football. We're going to take Gunner for his walk in the grove. He loves his walks." "Don't be too late," her father had warned her. On eavesdropping on their conversation earlier on at the lunch hour service while pretending to go to the powder room at the diner, I decided to follow the girls after they completed their shift to the grove, because I suspected the man in the hoodie called Warren Wheeler would be hot on their trail, and I was not wrong about that, because there his car was, parked right next to theirs. He had surreptitiously followed Lucinda and Gina around all week, and seemingly he was a patient man, and I didn't know what his end goal was, but I knew it was not good. The two blindly clueless girls had not noticed a thing. They knew not that they were being followed. I would know at once if someone was following me, but they had no idea about the perilous situation they had become embroiled in. When I saw Mr. Wheeler's car in that parking bay at the walking trail, my heart began to flip-flop frenziedly in my chest, and I wondered if the girls might be in perilous danger, and I suspected that they might well be. I immediately removed my hunting rifle from the trunk of my car and entered the grove very cautiously, more determined than ever to keep a beady eye on this man. As if he intended to harm those two girls, this would be the quintessential place he would likely do it, when there were no obvious witnesses around. I hurriedly moved through the trees, very cautiously, grateful that I was wearing sensible walking shoes and leggings. Ever since I'd been following this man around town, I had abandoned the flowery dresses I normally sported, as the man was a fast walker, and if I wanted to keep up with him, I needed to be wearing the appropriate clothing, and I'm very adaptable when needs must. In the last week I'd lost over 3 pounds on the bathroom scales from stalking him around, and I'm glad to say he had no clue he was being followed. I'm not exactly what I would describe as nimble or agile on my feet, but I still did my level best to stagger rather awkwardly down the long, lonely trails, covered in a plethora of fallen autumn leaves, as discreetly as I possibly could. I could hear Gina and Lucinda talking loudly. I could see this wasp-like fellow stalking them cautiously, going from one tree to another, very, very stealthily. I froze when I realized he had a rifle in his hands. I knew at once that his motives were deadly, and the gravity of the potential danger that both the girls were in hit me hard like a brick across the face. In the beginning, following this duplicitous, dodgy character around town had been a bit of a thrill for me, but now I realized I had taken on more than I could chew. I suspected he wanted Lucinda dead, and as Gina was with her, he'd likely kill her too, to eliminate the witness. I was tempted to call the town sheriff, who I believe was watching the football game, but if I made a call, I'd likely be heard, and by the time I called him, it could potentially be too late. I had a rifle with me, which I would use if this man imposed a threat to the two naive young women. Gina's large black poodle Gunner was running through the woods, barking happily, as he foraged through the undergrowth, rambunctiously chasing after interesting scent trails. I could hear the girls' conversation, as they were talking about how glad they were not to be at the football game. "Dad loves football," Gina was saying. "I don't know why he enjoys it so much. I'm so glad, Lucinda, you're on the same page as me. I don't care if it's my hometown. Of course I hope they win, but if they don't, it's no biggie as far as I'm concerned. But don't you dare tell my dad I told you that. Do you think that makes me a traitor to my hometown?" "Of course it doesn't, silly," came Lucinda's reassuring voice. "You're not interested in sport. That's hardly what I'd describe as a crime, is it?" "I've never particularly liked sports either," Lucinda admitted. "Never been my thing. My grandpa Otis loved sport, but I never shared his interest." The voices of both Gina and Lucinda became muted as they sped up their walking pace, down the long earthen paths, bespeckled with the golden leaves, with Warren stealthily creeping behind them as he slipped behind one tree to the next, being as furtive as possible, and surprisingly he was pretty noiseless. I was the one that needed to watch myself, as I was not nearly so quiet. As I trailed Warren, I had the overwhelming sense that I too was being followed, but that could not be. Who would be stalking me? I was sure I'd heard twigs crackling, snapping and popping, and pounding feet hitting the ground behind me. But when I turned around, nothing was there. I could hear the blood from my booming heart pounding violently in my ears, so I was sure it was my nerves playing tricks on me. Of course nothing was trailing me. What was I like? I must have imagined the whole thing. But the sense that somebody was behind me would not abandon my thoughts, not even for a brief moment. I gingerly crept from one tree trunk to the next, being incredibly selective of where I placed my foot. As the leaves rustled, twigs broke, and I didn't want to draw any unwanted attention to myself, as one wrong move, I could catapult myself into danger. There was a gentle breeze blowing through the grove, nudging my skin with its cool gasps, and a few leaves seemed to float up in the air as the boughs of the trees began to swing very gently. All of a sudden Gina and Lucinda stopped dead in their tracks. They appeared to be examining something on the ground. I heard Gina say, "Oh my goodness, look at this, Lucinda. There must be over a dozen spent shells over here. It's prohibited to hunt in these woods. It's got to be a poacher. I'll have to inform the sheriff about this when we get home." The girls began leaning over to examine the shells, and Lucinda was saying, "It's too late. Whoever was in here has long gone. What's wrong with people? Why do they do this? If they want to hunt, they should do it legally." "I suspect they get a thrill from breaking the law," said Gina. All of a sudden I could see that Warren Wheeler, who was standing behind a large trunk of a tree, was taking this opportunity to aim his rifle at Lucinda, while both girls were examining some of the spent bullets on the forest floor. I wanted to scream out, "Run, Lucinda, run!" but I was so terrified that the man would turn around and take aim at me too, even though I had a rifle in my own hands. I was terrified of even using it. My fingers had become like jelly. I wanted to warn the girls, and then something bizarre happened. A shrill whistle ran through the grove. "What the hell is that?" asked Lucinda, turning around to look behind her.
"Something's in the grove with us, and it's not a bird," I heard Lucinda saying. "I don't know anyone who can whistle like that, do you?" "It's weird," said Gina. "I've never heard a whistle like that before." The whistle had taken Warren Wheeler off guard. He was probably concerned somebody else was in the grove, because he did not want to be seen. He did not need any witnesses. The whistling stopped, and the girls continued along their way, with Gunner barking excitedly. I could see Warren Wheeler's confidence had completely flatlined. He looked very nervous and anxious. He kept looking behind him as if he was somewhat discomposed. Then something happened even more unorthodox than I could ever have believed. As a stone was launched at Warren, it came flying violently through the trees, hitting him square in the shoulders, throwing him off his feet so that his rifle slipped like butter from between his fingers, and he landed on his back, groaning and gasping in pain. In a trice I saw a huge, big, black, hairy being, thundering through the trees, moving like the wind. I couldn't react in time, because I was so dumbfounded that I just froze to the spot, more in shock than in fear. And then I saw her, a female Bigfoot, lunging towards Warren Wheeler, standing over him with her 2 powerful legs on either side of him. She looked down at him. The young man let out a shrill, terrified scream, which I guess was to be expected, as he found himself staring up at the most daunting, intimidating and terrifying creature he had ever seen in his entire life. You do not want a Bigfoot standing over you, because it will be the end of you. The Bigfoot kicked him in the head, and I knew in that instant he was dead. His head went flying off his neck, rolling into the grove like a football. The female Bigfoot looked up at me. She could see me peeking at her from behind the tree, and on seeing my shocked face, she said apologetically, "Sorry about that. It wasn't pleasant to watch, I know, but he needed to go. He was trouble." She spoke to me telepathically in my head, and I was flummoxed, and with that she glided away. And I'm thinking to myself, did that just happen? Did I just see that? Did that female Bigfoot just speak to me in my head? Did she just kick off a man's head? It had happened so fast, it was easy to ask myself if it had happened at all. I ran over to the young man, but I was exposed to a headless corpse, and this time I was the one that screamed. I wish I could have had sympathy for this odorous young man, but I did not. He had intended to kill Lucinda. All of a sudden the 2 girls came bolting towards me, and on seeing me and the headless corpse, they both screamed. "What the hell happened? We heard the noise! We heard the man's screams!" Lucinda looked down at the corpse and realized there was no head. "Where is his head?" she asked. I pointed towards the tree. Lucinda promptly ran to the tree to examine the head, and ran back, her face as white as a sheet. "Oh my God, that's Wasp! He must have been following us into the grove! He's dead now! How the hell did all that happen?" Gina was holding her chest, struggling to breathe from the shock, while Ganna was now scratching at the deceased corpse on the ground and barking at it. "Remember I told you about Wasp, Gina? He's Robin Wheeler's brother. He was after me. He wanted to kill me because his brother is in prison for life on my account. I put him there, as I told the police what he'd done, when he confided in me about the people he murdered. Remember I was dating him at the time, and he offloaded some of his secrets to me, which I shared with the police. I ran away to the small town to get away from him, as his own girlfriend, whom I knew personally, warned me that he intended to kill me, because I'd blabbed on his brother, and now he's dead. I can't believe it. I know I shouldn't say this, but I'm so relieved he's gone. I'm free now. How did he die, Mrs. Petticock? You didn't shoot him. I would have heard the gunfire. But how the hell did his head just come off his body like this? We heard him scream. We heard a thunderous crashing noise, and then nothing after that. What actually happened?" "That's a very good question, Lucinda. And quite honestly, I don't think you will believe me if I told you what happened. If you must know, It was a female Bigfoot that killed this man that you call Wasp. She kicked his head right off and apologized to me, saying I'm sorry, but it had to be done. I know it sounds incredulous, but it's true. In fact, when you heard the whistling, I believe the whistling came from the Bigfoot, because this man was actually aiming a rifle at you, Lucinda. He intended to kill you. I'm in no doubt about that. And let's just say, the Bigfoot threw a stone at him so that he fell right off his feet. So when you heard the groaning sound, that was him. He screamed when he saw the Bigfoot, and the Bigfoot then just kicked his head off as if it was a soccer ball. I couldn't believe what I was physically seeing, but I assure you, I'm not making any of this up. I believe you, Mrs. Petticock. We both do. You do? I am surprised you say that, because I'm not sure if somebody told me something like this, that I would believe them. Of course we believe you. But what I want to know is, how did you come to be in this grove? That's what I want to know. I've never seen you here before. And as far as I know, you don't own a dog. I don't know where to begin, Lucinda. Let's just say, when you arrived in our small town, I was very sceptical about you. I knew you were running away from something. That was plain to see. I hoped in your case it was an abusive husband, and not the law. I kept my beady eyes pinned on you. But I never found out anything about you. But when the eating contest occurred in our town, and you handed the girl tomato ketchup on camera, I knew that your YouTube video could potentially be seen by many people, and that you would ultimately be recognized by one person. Lucinda looked at me with a confounded expression on her face, her hand covering her mouth in astonishment. You're joking. Someone recognized me on YouTube. It appears so, I said. After the eating competition, someone started stalking you almost a week to the day. So I followed him around. I discovered he was staying at Roach's motel. So I found out his name from Roach. After, a little bit of snooping here and there, we discovered his name was Warren Wheeler, otherwise known as Wasp. And I knew for some reason he was after you. I did wonder if he was your husband for a while. I followed him into the grove today. And there is the end of our story. Basically, the Bigfoot came to your rescue. She saved your life. Without that, I'm in no doubt you would not be here with us right now. And you too, Gina. You might not be here either. And maybe I would be surplus to requirements as well. Because this man was terrifying. There are no other words to describe him. I'm glad he's gone, and I don't hesitate to tell you that.
We all decided to say nothing about the body in the grove, as how would we explain it was a Bigfoot that had kicked the head off Warren Wheeler? It was only days later that the body of Warren Wheeler was found in some farmland by a local rancher somewhere, next to his decapitated head. So I believe the Bigfoot came back and took the body to another location after we had gone. The police believed he'd come to a Montana town to chase after Lucinda. It turned out he was a person of suspicion, involved in a couple of missing persons cases. So it would seem both brothers were incredibly evil men. And it seems that Lucinda's love light had turned around, as she is no longer attracted to bad boys. She still lives in our Montana town, and married a local man, and she's still best friends with Gina Cowslipper, and the Cowslipper family, of course. I'm known to everyone as the town busybody, but I don't care about that. I believe it's good to have your wits about you. So there you are. That's my story. Wow, isn't that the most incredible story? And what an amazing adventure, leaving behind your city in Chicago and coming to a small Montana town and being pursued by this man who sees you on a YouTube video, who's got nasty intentions towards you, and staying in the most ghastly motel where somebody actually died. Certainly A trail of devastation appeared to have followed Lucinda. But what a lovely ending to the story. I'm not talking about the decapitated head, obviously I'm not, but I'm talking about the fact that Lucinda was now free to live her life as a free woman without having to look over her shoulders and concern herself about being followed and stalked by Wasp because he was no longer around. So what a relief that must have been for her. Until next time, goodbye and good night.